Most people believe the reason they can't change a behavior is willpower. Duhigg spent years proving it isn't. And the proof started in an aluminum factory in 1987. In 1987, a new CEO stood in front of Wall Street investors and said something nobody expected. He didn't talk about profits. He didn't talk about market share or restructuring costs or quarterly targets. He said Alcoa, one of America's largest aluminum companies, a company bleeding losses, was going to become the safest workplace in America. That was his plan. That was all he was focused on. Investors left the room convinced the man had lost his mind. One called his clients from a payphone outside and told them to sell. Within a year, Alcoa's profits hit an all-time record. Within a decade, its market cap had risen by $5 billion. Paul O'Neill hadn't fixed the company's finances. He had found one habit, worker safety, and changed everything else by pulling that single thread. Charles Duhigg spent years studying behavior change, from neuroscience labs to NFL locker rooms, looking for the mechanism underneath. What he found was that O'Neill had stumbled onto something most people spend their entire lives missing. This is the power of habit. Picture this. You've tried to change a behavior, a snacking habit, a scrolling routine, a tendency to procrastinate, more times than you want to count. You've made to set the intentions. You've felt the motivation, genuinely at the start. And somewhere between the decision and the follow-through, the old pattern reasserted itself so smoothly, you barely noticed it happening. Most people conclude from this that they lack discipline, that other people have something, willpower, self-control, the right personality, that makes change easier for them than it is for you. The behavior isn't failing because you lack willpower. It's running on a loop your brain built years ago, a loop that operates below conscious awareness, efficiently and automatically, exactly the way it was designed to. Understanding the loop is the thing that was missing, not motivation. At the center of this book is a three-part mechanism Duhigg calls the habit loop, and once you can see it in your own behavior, you cannot unsee it. A cue triggers the behavior, a time of day, an emotional state, a physical location, a social situation. The routine follows automatically, the behavior itself, and the reward lands at the end. The relief, the pleasure, the small satisfaction the brain was seeking when it launched the routine in the first place. The brain, Duhigg explains, is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine. When it encounters the same cue repeatedly, it begins to automate the routine that follows, offloading it from conscious thought entirely. The same way a driver who's been on a familiar route for years suddenly arrives at work with almost no memory of the specific turns they made. Efficiency is the goal. The brain doesn't distinguish between a habit that serves you and a habit that doesn't. It simply runs the loop. Duhigg describes an experiment where researchers traced the brain activity of rats running a maze for a food reward. Early in the process, the rats' brains were highly active throughout, processing every turn, every decision, every new piece of information. After weeks of running the same maze, the brain activity collapsed to almost nothing during the run itself, spiking only at the beginning when the cue appeared, and at the end when the reward arrived. The behavior in the middle had been fully automated. The rat's brains had essentially outsourced the maze to a cheaper, lower energy process, which freed the higher brain to think about something else entirely. This is why willpower alone so rarely works. The cue still arrives. The craving still fires. And without a different routine waiting to receive it, the brain defaults to the one it already knows, not out of weakness, but out of efficiency. But underneath the three-part loop is something Duhigg considers the most important and most overlooked force of all. The craving fires before you even take the action. Once a habit is established, the cue doesn't just trigger the routine, it triggers a neurological wanting for the reward before the routine even begins. That anticipation is what makes the loop feel compulsive rather than optional. And it's the piece almost nobody thinks to look for when they're trying to change a behavior. Duhigg illustrates this with the story of how toothbrushing became a universal habit. Before the 1900s, almost nobody brushed their teeth. An advertising genius named Claude Hopkins created the first successful toothpaste campaign, not by promoting dental health, but by training people to notice a specific cue, the filmy sensation on their teeth in the morning, and to crave the tingling, clean feeling that Pepsodent delivered afterward. He didn't invent the behavior. He engineered the craving. And once the craving was installed, the habit ran itself. This is the piece most people miss when they try to change a behavior. They eliminate the routine, but the cue still arrives, and the craving still fires, now with nowhere to go. The most effective change, Duhigg argues, isn't removing the routine. It's replacing it with something that delivers the same reward, responding to the same cue, satisfying the same underlying craving. Paul O'Neill's safety campaign at Alcoa wasn't random. He understood intuitively what Duhigg documents throughout this book, that some habits don't just change the behavior they target. They create ripple effects across an entire system. Duhigg calls these keystone habits, behaviors that, when changed, trigger a cascade of other changes the person never directly targeted. Exercise is the clearest example. Study after study shows that people who begin a consistent exercise routine start eating better, drinking less, sleeping more, and managing their money more carefully, none of which they set out to change. The discipline built in one corner of their life quietly restructures the rest. The mechanism behind this isn't mysterious. A keystone habit works by creating what Duhigg calls small wins, early, visible successes that change a person's self-perception, making further change feel possible in a way it didn't before. The person who exercises consistently begins to think of themselves, gradually, as someone who keeps commitments. That revised self-image then bleeds into unrelated areas of life, making other commitments slightly easier to keep in ways that seem almost accidental. This is why O'Neill chose safety. Not because safety was the company's most urgent problem, but because changing it required every level of the organization, from the factory floor to the executive suite, to communicate, coordinate, and build entirely new routines together. Safety was the keystone. Everything else followed from pulling it. Near the end of this book, Duhigg makes a claim that reframes everything that came before it. Habits he argues, are never truly destroyed. They are only overwritten. The neural pathway built by years of repetition doesn't disappear when you stop a behavior. It simply goes dormant, waiting for the right cue to reactivate it. This is why a habit broken for months can return fully formed in a single, stressful afternoon. The loop was never gone. It was waiting. What changes when you understand this isn't the difficulty of behavior change, it's the strategy. You stop trying to eliminate a loop you cannot destroy and start building a new loop deliberately. Same cue, same reward, different routine, until the new pathway becomes the one the brain reaches for first. The person who finally changes a long-standing behavior usually isn't the person who summoned more willpower. They're the person who stopped fighting the loop and started working with its structure instead. Understanding what cue was triggering the routine, what reward the routine was actually delivering, and what else could deliver that same reward without the cost. That is a completely different kind of work than most behavior change advice asks people to do. And it is, in Duhigg's account, the only kind that actually holds. That is the real argument of this book. Not that habits are easy to change, not that the right morning routine will fix everything, but that behavior change has a mechanism, a specific, learnable structure, and that most people have been fighting their own habits without ever understanding what they were actually up against. Somewhere in the last few minutes, a specific habit probably came to mind, one you've tried to break or one you've been trying to build and can't quite explain why it hasn't stuck. The investor who called his clients from a payphone and told them to sell had the same information O'Neill did. The only difference was that O'Neill understood what he was actually pulling on, and the investor didn't. Duhigg's answer isn't a better version of motivation. It's a different question entirely. What is the cue? What is the craving? And what reward is the loop actually seeking? Answer those three questions honestly, and the behavior that felt random starts to look like exactly what it is. A pattern your brain built for a reason, running exactly as designed. If this gave you something worth starting today, subscribe. Because the next video on this channel might be the next mechanism nobody ever clearly named for you either. See you in the next one.